We have mentioned complicated grief here and there in the previous instalments. I would like to focus on complicated grief just now, and I guess maybe to start with a definition, what is complicated grief? And it really is an experience where there are other aspects of the situation that make it difficult to just be sad. As I said, if you're really old and your sibling is older and they've come to a very natural, organic end of their life, that removes the tragedy from it. But as I said, I suspect that most of you are sitting here and a sibling has endured a premature death, and that in itself can be really complicated as well. So again, the sibling may have passed away very suddenly from a medical issue. Maybe they just died suddenly from a cardiac arrest or a brain hemorrhage or something, and there was little or no warning. Maybe they had a few months or a few weeks or a few days in hospital, or maybe it was just extremely sudden. Maybe it was something like a diagnosis of cancer that was there for a long time, and you watched this person suffering, or even a longer medical illness that you knew inevitably would result in the person's death, and maybe for years and years everyone was enduring this, I suppose, knowing where this is going to end, and that is very, very difficult for a person, because you're living in a family situation with a living death. The person is still with us, but we know that they're not going to be here. Their life is going to be basically cut short. We don't know when, or maybe we do know that they have a number of years or a number of weeks or a number of days, and that can be incredibly painful. And also the complexity happens when we lose a sibling through an unexpected or traumatic circumstances, like a road traffic accident or a murder or a medical trauma that really could have been prevented. And this brings with it an added dimension of horror, because this person's death may not have been peaceful, may have been preventable, so it causes you another layer of anguish altogether. Very, very difficult. And you're not just with the sadness, but you're with the nature of the death as well, and you're going back over it, and even if you weren't there, you imagine it in your head, and what happens, you visually traumatize yourself, because you hear the details of this experience, and you imagine your sister or brother going through this and what it must have been like for them, and you replay this horror story in your head time and time again and again. If you're doing that, and if you're having nightmares about it as well and becoming very preoccupied, now might be a good time for you to find support, to talk to someone about that, because in order to really come away from that, you have to make peace with the torture that there is there. Another profound pain that sadly so many families experience is death by suicide of a sibling, and I suppose that loss impacts the entire family, and it causes grief and disrupted relationships. And particularly wanted to talk a little bit about suicide, because suicide is still quite a difficult thing for us to get our heads around. For most people, unless you have been to that place yourself where you think, my life isn't worth living, we cannot imagine how someone could ever die by suicide. They could ever even contemplate it. So it can cause such an awful bewilderment for people who are left behind. And also, suicide is still unfortunately very misunderstood, and there's a lot of shame and stigma still attached to it, sadly. So we mistakenly think that it's a selfish act. It's really very far from a selfish act, actually, even though to the people left behind it can seem like that. And also there's just a sense of huge shock and disbelief, and it's because it's such a trauma, we don't know how to deal with it, and certainly no one else knows how to deal with it. So very often the fact that the death was by suicide goes under the radar. Even in a death notice in a paper, we'll hear that the person died suddenly, and usually, not always, but usually we will translate suddenly as suicide. It's a very taboo word, and if I meet you and I want to express my condolences, if the death was suicide, I'm more likely to cross the street when I see you coming, because I don't know what to say and I don't know how to acknowledge this. And of course, some members of a family can be very open that yes, our brother or sister died by suicide, and there is no shame in it, and it's no different than any other experience of grief. And other family members can have a very, very difficult time accepting it, and don't want the word suicide mentioned in the family, and are very shamed, maybe angry about it. So I guess there's a complicated dimension there with suicide, that also there's huge guilt and self-blame there. I've never met anyone where there has been a death by suicide in a family who doesn't feel some experience of self-blame, that I could have prevented it, that had I done this, had I said that, had I noticed this. There is always an aftermath of powerlessness, that there's something I should have done, and had I reached out in this particular way, had I noticed this, I could have prevented it. So again, when we think of the unexpected traumatic deaths, you know, whether they are medical, whether they are accidents, whether they are intentional murders, or maybe something like suicide, which creates an awful lot of very difficult feeling in families, we can understand that the nature of these dynamics that surround the grief can overshadow the feelings of sadness and loss. So maybe I put my grief to the side and I'm more focused on justice, or I'm more focused on finding out the information, or investigations, or and torment and nightmares, than actually how I feel. I am absolutely devastated. So that again can be difficult, and can really, your sadness, your loss can be sidetracked and completely, and the person can often mobilize with anger, or live in shock and disbelief for years and years. And you know, when we say, oh, the person never got over the death, actually often it's not that the person never got over the death, but the person never got over the nature of the death and the dynamics surrounding the death, to ever get to the place where they could grieve and loss. So if you're listening to this and you can really resonate with that and feel, my goodness, yeah, that we've had an extremely traumatic death in our family, and I am still really attached to the situation around the death, and it complicates everything. Again, it may be a time where you say, I may need some additional support here to tease this out and to understand it, because it's a huge task for someone to try to come to terms with grief and also unbearable dynamics.